Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Alana Harrison, and I'm the Professional Education Coordinator for the Environmental Law Institute. So you've joined us today for Citizen Science, New Technologies in Wetlands Monitoring, a special public seminar that we're hosting for the National Wetlands Awards. For the audience in the room, if you have a question, please let me give you a microphone, this microphone, so everyone can hear the question. Our microphones are here simply to capture the audio. So there's no need to speak directly into them, as I am doing now. If you're participating via webinar, as 50 or so are right now, you can ask a question by submitting it through GoTo's question box. Please do not hold your questions until the end. Send them as soon as you think of them. I'd also like to thank our wonderful panel for being here with us today, as well as the 2016 National Wetlands Awards winners that we have here in the room. The full speaker bios are posted on our website, www.eli.org, and video and audio recordings of today's discussion will be available on our website within the next week. So with that, I'll turn things to Catherine Campbell, who's our manager of the National Wetlands Awards, to introduce our winners for this year.
Thank you all again for attending and helping ELI celebrate American Wetlands Month. In addition to this panel today, we will be holding the National Wetlands Awards ceremony this evening at the U.S. Botanic Gardens. There is still time to RSVP if you'd like to attend this evening. It will be from 6 to 8, and you can register on our website at www.nationalwetlandsawards.org. You can also learn more about our current 2016 winners and all of our past winners on our website. So right now I just want to quickly introduce our winners today and present them with some welcome bags we have for them. First we have Peter David, who won the Conservation and Restoration Award this year. He is a wildlife biologist with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and he works throughout the state with federal, local, tribal governments to restore and protect wild rice in the upper Midwest region. Next we have Dr. Pamela Blanchard, who won the Education and Outreach Award. She's an associate professor at Louisiana State University School of Education. She co-founded the LSU Coastal Roots Seedling Nursery Program, where students from second grade through high school learn how to grow native plants and participate in restoration trips. Next we have Tom Bernthal, who won the State, Tribal, and Local Program Development Award. He is the Wetlands Monitoring and Assessment Coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He has led efforts throughout the state to research, restore, and educate people on wetlands. Next we have Dr. K. Ramesh Reddy, who won the Science Research Award. He is a graduate professor and department chair for the Soil and Water Science Department at the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Science. For over 40 years, he has led research on biogeochemical cycling of nutrients in wetlands, and in particularly has been involved in Everglades restoration. And finally, we have Roberto Viqueira, and he won the Wetland Community Leader Award. He is the director and co-founder of Protectoras de Cuncas, a nonprofit that works with government and the community of Puerto Rico to restore and protect watersheds and the associated ecosystems throughout Puerto Rico. And I also just want to recognize Jan Goldman Carter, who is also a previous National Wetlands Award winner on the panel today. So thank you and congratulations again.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And now I would like to briefly introduce our moderator for today's panel. Martha Maripes is a partner with Keller and Heckman LLP and a member of the ELI Board of Directors. Her practice focuses on emerging technologies in the industrial chemicals, alternative energy, antimicrobial, pesticides, plastic recycling, and food sectors. We're glad to have her today, and with that, I'll turn things over to Martha, who will introduce our panel in the discussion of today's topic.
Thank you, and good day, everyone. I am Martha Merifes and a partner in the private practice of law with Keller and Heckman. But as a personal note, I am also a longtime observer of our topic here today, citizen science. I grew up on a small lake in New Hampshire and saw my mother-in-law single-handedly save our lake on more than one occasion. And in college, I worked for the Audubon Society, doing a census of loons across the state of New Hampshire, and relied heavily on citizen volunteers, as our award winners today probably and panelists can appreciate. And now in my work in private practice, I see the role of citizen science emerging as a larger and larger force in the confluence of science and law. So I'm also here today as a board member of ELI, as they noted, and ELI is proud and pleased to sponsor the National Wetland Award ceremony. Our highly accomplished award winners appreciate the role of citizen science, appreciate the critical role of wetlands in our ecology. They make a difference every day with their work to preserve our wetlands. And as part of our tribute to the importance of their work, we are going to examine the role of citizen science today in the area in the context of wetlands. Citizen science, I have to say, when I was asked to moderate, I had to kind of get my hands around the new term for it. As I said, I've seen it practically all of my life. But, Jim McElfish with ELI reminded me that an early example of citizen science were the bird censuses that many of us participated in on Christmas Day. And now, that's really evolved into apps on your phone where you can log in data in these crowdsourcing sites, or log in and or take methane, emissions monitoring measurements on your phone, and again report these in an electronic way and in an electronic age. So that's citizen science is science in action, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Now, ELI, through the work of Jim McElfish, who's director of ELI's Sustainable Use of Lands program, and also Jake Prendergrass, who's ELI's vice president of programs and publications, and Talia Fox, who's a research associate here at ELI, recently completed this report, Clearing the Path for Citizen Science in Public Policy, with researchers at the Commons Lab at the Woodrow Wilson Institute Center for Scholars. This report is available electronically to download. Has a lot of great graphics, so it might not print out that great, but it's a wonderful report. I commit it to your attention. It covers the evolution of citizen science, and many of the issues involved with breaking down government barriers to the use of citizen science. And these are both technical issues about the integrity of the data and management of the data and how to use the data, but also legal issues in terms of just allowing the government to be able to efficiently use the resource of citizen science. So this is a great report, and I commit it to your attention. There is quite a bit of new government activity in this area. In fact, there is a GSA, a Government Service Administration website, which ELI would also like to make sure everybody is aware of. It's www.citizenscience.gov, and that website provides a catalog of federally related citizen science efforts that are ongoing right now. And it was just launched in April. So as many things that ELI does, this is a very current and relevant topic. So let's get on with it. In this era of big data, more data, how we might use all of this data, and questions about what we can accomplish with it, today's session is intended to provide the audience with real-world examples of how citizen science is being conducted and used to ensure the integrity and quality of wetlands. And we have with us today a number of excellent speakers who are going to talk about what they're doing and the issues associated with it. And I will just briefly introduce them, and then and turn the program over to them. We have to my right Tom Bernthal, who's Wetlands Monitoring and Assessment Coordinator with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and one of our 2016 award winners. To his right, Ann Dunkel, Program Manager with the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative for the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. Welcome, Ann. Jan Goldman Carter, who's Director of Wetlands and Water with the National Wildlife Federation on the end of our table. And of course, Avi Sarin, not necessarily in order, but please pardon that, President and Principal of TNT Environmental. I'd like to remind everybody before we begin our program to please fill out your evaluations on this fine program. I've been asked to do that, but without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our panel.
Okay. So
You should be
I'll
all set.
just press the
Yep.
button. Okay. Hi, I'm Tom Bernthal. I am the Monitoring Assessment Coordinator with the DNR in Wisconsin, the Department of Natural Resources. And in Wisconsin, the Department of Natural Resources is pretty much the super agency that has fish and wildlife and parks and recreation and water quality and all the programs that sometimes are put into different agencies are in one large one. So I am not the citizen monitoring coordinator, but I did talk to the two women who are monitoring or are coordinating most of the monitoring, and we have a citizen-based monitoring program at the Wisconsin DNR. I've got some bullets up here on that. This is information they've passed on to me. I also have a monitoring project that we did in ephemeral ponds that I'll talk about in some detail. And the good news is I can see the clock, so I'll know when my 10 minutes are up. So we actually do have quite a bit of projects that are going on. It's 24 different projects. And we're getting citizen-based monitoring is a subset of citizen science. And so these are all scientific projects that have a scientific design and they have a purpose to them. They are not projects to keep people happy, to give them something to do outdoors. That's a good benefit of them, but when we learned quite a while ago that you need to have a focus for what you're doing, and then you won't be led astray. So the water monitoring strategy, I'm in the Water Quality Bureau, and we have actually written water volunteer monitoring into our strategy. So we have a program called Water Action Volunteers that does a lot of stream monitoring, lake monitoring, from SekiDisk to collecting water quality samples to doing plant surveys. So there's a lot of activity. And then a lot of the programs that deal with citizen monitoring are people in the natural heritage world. So when I get into that, you'll get to see the range of projects that we have. We actually have a full-time coordinator, and we have a grant program that gives out $100,000 annually to citizen-based monitoring groups. So here's the list. And you can see that there's a lot of kind of natural history-oriented birds, damselflies, bats, carnivore, deer, rare plants. So a good chunk of our monitoring projects have been designed coming from the researchers themselves that want the data, that there simply aren't enough that you could hire to cover the range of geography that you can cover with trained volunteers. So I mentioned Water Action Volunteers down at the bottom. That really, and Martha was talking about her mother saving the lake. We have many instances.
Mother-in-law, by the way.
Mother-in-law, okay. Many instances over the decades. We've had a long Wisconsin Association of Lakes, very strong organization. and they've been doing lake water clarity monitoring for a long time. Everybody probably knows what a Secchi disc is. You drop a pie plate into the water, it's got a target on it, and you just lower that into the water until you can't see it anymore, and then you bring it back up and you measure the depth at which you can start to see it again. That's just a simple measure of water clarity, but it fuels a lot of our assessment of lakes. We coordinated about 10 years ago a project where we're able to use satellite imagery to classify lakes by their water clarity, and the way that we calibrated that was we had, I think it was over 500 lakes that citizens were doing these very simple Secchi disc readings, and that was informing the person who was doing the classification that was telling us what the water clarity of our lakes is. So now every year we can use satellite imagery and we can get a snapshot on the water clarity part of our lakes. So that's one example. Other example I'm going to give is the one that I was personally involved in and learned a lot of lessons about as the wetland monitoring coordinator. So this was the Wisconsin Ephemeral Ponds Project. The citizen monitoring part of it tied into a mapping project that we did in southeastern Wisconsin, where we spent about 2 years using the best topographic data, the best soils data, the best aerial photography that we could get a hold of. Started with the Wisconsin Wetland Inventory and mapped what we called potential ephemeral ponds. In other words, we're mapping them, we think they're ephemeral ponds, but now we got to have somebody go out on the landscape and see how many of these are verified ephemeral ponds. And we did that with our own staff and with county staff, but we also got a network of volunteer monitors. We had 16 different organizations, from nature centers to UW Parkside, Concordia College, and the county staff that were involved in this monitoring network. So the first part of our project was the mapping. That was kind of the in-house part. But the monitoring part was the ground truthing and the beginning to study these things and understand their biology. So we spent a lot of time. We had a full-time staff person that worked on this project about, I think, 20% of her time, and she organized those 16 agencies and groups into this monitoring network. And then we worked with those partners to deliver the training sessions that we would do in March and April. One of the tricky things about ephemeral ponds is you want to get out there as soon as the ice melts, and when you're planning, when are we going to have this training session? Should it be March 10th or April 10th? Well, depends on when the ice is going to go out. So we were pretty lucky that most of our best laid plans worked out in terms of the timing. So we trained people on the basics of what an ephemeral pond looks like, and then we asked them to do some pretty simple things. How deep is the water? About how big is the ponded area? Can you see lines on trees that in the upper left-hand corner that, no, it's not showing. See watermarks on trees that are indicative of where the water, high water has been periodically, regularly over the course of many years. So we get people out and have them do pretty simple things, and the purpose was to tell us whether what we had mapped as a potential pond was really a verified pond. And this is our monitoring form, which I'm sure you can't read. In 2009, if I had shown you the one from 2008, that instruction page on the right, which we got down to 11-point font and 2 pages, originated as 9-point font and 3 pages. So the first lesson we learned after our first year was we were asking for way too much information. We needed to get down to the essentials. So we got it to temperature, depth, and repeated visits. So tell us when what the depth is, come back 2 weeks later, tell us the same, measure the same simple things, and then from that data we were able to judge how our mapping was doing. And so we did this over several years. In the original area, we mapped 8,296 of these potentially ephemeral ponds. We've actually managed to get to 753 of them. That's with a lot of county staff and DNR staff, and 160 over 2 years were done by volunteers. So the results were, we were telling people it's okay to say, I don't know if this is an ephemeral pond or not. And so we had 138 that were not sure, 615 they decided, and then of those we had a pretty good success rate. 74% were verified ephemeral ponds, but the other 15% were other types of wetlands. So it wasn't like we were mapping things that weren't even wetland for the most part. So 11% other things like rock piles. Kind of embarrassing to the mapper. So that was our mapping area, and then after we had done a couple years of this basic, working mostly in the spring, people wanted to get out in the fall, so we developed a training session that focused more on those watermarks on trees and the bare vegetation and changes in vegetation that would indicate that water had been there, and started a program for doing that. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is how we hooked that into our natural heritage inventory. So a lot of those other programs that I showed, the bats and the birds and the dragonflies, those are run by people in our natural heritage conservation section. And we have this natural heritage inventory that lists all the natural communities of Wisconsin, and they're listing high quality things. So they did have a category of ephemeral ponds, and when we get into the uses of the information, I wanted to hit this point that people screen the natural heritage inventory when they're doing a transportation project or a big project that requires an environmental review. So that's one of the uses of getting more ephemeral ponds into their database. So they had a definition, and the critical thing is the second star there. For it to be NHI worthy, you needed to be a breeding habitat for invertebrates and amphibians. So the data that we had gathered over 4 years, I should go back to this slide. So in the natural heritage inventory, before we did this project, here are the sites in southeastern Wisconsin. If you count the dots, there's about 12 of them. So we had these 700 ponds that had been surveyed. Not all of them had been looked at for biota, but we did have some biotic data, and then we spent some money going back and doing amphibian breeding surveys. So we sent 450 ponds worth of data to the NHI. They screened for their criteria, and 99 of the areas that they screened met their definition of a high-quality amphibian reproduction habitat area that could be listed. And so they now have 99 ponds plus 12 in southeastern Wisconsin. That actually doubled the number of ephemeral ponds in the whole state. So that's quite a large increase, and it was possible because of the citizen-gathered data. And so that's kind of my example on ephemeral ponds. Some of the lessons learned were to simplify things and to have this network of nature centers working on this. Unfortunately, the program is semi-dormant now. There's still some areas that are quite active. The grant funding that I had to do the project is no longer with us, and so it's continuing on, but at a much lesser level than it was when we had the wetland grant supporting it and the coastal grant supporting it. I think I ran over my time.
Not at all, Tom. Thank you. That was excellent. In terms of questions from the audience, you can feel free to raise your hand after each presentation if you'd like, and we've also saved a good amount of time for the end of our program to get into those questions and more discussion. So seeing no hands, Anne, we'll turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you for having me here today. So I'm with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, and we're involved in a couple of water quality monitoring projects that utilize volunteer monitors. Our historic project has been our River Trends volunteer monitoring project that has been in place for over 30 years. We've monitored about 300 sites in the states of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and over 400 volunteers have been involved in collecting water quality data. So they're collecting baseline water quality data in streams in their backyards, such as dissolved oxygen, pH, temperature, water clarity, nutrients, and any other things that they're curious about in their backyards. So there's lots of different types of citizen science monitoring projects, volunteer monitoring projects. The form that our River Trends project takes is more of a grassroots form. So sometimes you have citizen science projects that are coming from a research institution that has a question, and then using the power of numbers, collect volunteers to go out and collect the data, which is really powerful. But in another form, you have more of a grassroots attack at volunteer monitoring. So you have actual communities asking the research questions for themselves. They're curious about what is the health of the streams or the wetlands or the water quality in their own community, and organizing and then gaining the tools and the resources they need to answer these questions. So our River Trends program provides these groups like homeowners associations, master naturalist groups, just any individual that's curious about answering these questions. We provide them with the tools that they need, such as the training and the equipment, as well as the quality assurance and quality control assistance, and giving them that documentation so that their data can then go on to be used by, in our case for Virginia, the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. So there's a few different reasons why people are so interested in citizen science and volunteer monitoring data. You know, Martha definitely talked about one of the reasons that it's really engaging the communities and educating the communities themselves about these water quality issues. So volunteer monitoring really increases our environmental literacy in our community, which is such a powerful aspect of citizen science and volunteer monitoring. So these monitors don't just know inherently how to go out and take a water quality sample. They go through a fairly rigorous training process where not only are they learning how to sample, but they're learning why. They're learning why are these water quality issues really important. So why is low DH in our streams important, and how does land use affect nutrients that are going into our streams? So then we're educating each one of these individual volunteer monitors, and say they go to a barbecue the next weekend and talk about, yeah, last weekend I was taking a stream sample, and their neighbor asks them, well, why did you do that? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And then that's engaging a community on a level that maybe our state agencies might not be able to do otherwise. And then not only are we increasing just the environmental literacy of these groups, but just the sheer volume of the number of data points is something that is really enticing to communities and state agencies and federal agencies. So there's a lot of value that's placed into these groups, and that's one of the reasons that we're all here, right? There's some hesitancy that we recognize that comes from quality issues with volunteer data quality. And so some of really great ways to approach that is actually to work directly with these groups. So instead of the research top-down approach using volunteer data, collaborating with them and working with them to establish quality control, quality assurance procedures. And there's a lot of really great models for that. Wisconsin, obviously, Missouri, and then the state of Virginia has a really wonderful program where they work with volunteers to get that kind of documentation in place and train them properly so that the data that they collect is of a known quality. And within the spectrum of volunteer monitoring, there's lots of different levels of what the capabilities of volunteer monitoring is. So you might have some groups that have paid staff, multiple staff members, and they have lots of resources to have fancy equipment and go out, to small groups that maybe only have a couple of volunteers. And so the recognition by some of the states that volunteer monitoring comes in lots of different forms is really valuable. And there's a tiered system that the state of Virginia and a few other states are using to approach that. And it's a really creative approach to working with volunteer monitoring data. So for water quality data, tier 3 level would be volunteer monitoring data is at the level of what a Virginia DEQ field tech would go out and collect. So really high quality assurance, quality control procedures. And they can use that data for listing and delisting streams and doing streams assessments. And that's really powerful, not only for the state, but also for the communities to have an involvement in that process of saying this stream or water body is impaired, or this stream or water body has gone through a process where it's not impaired anymore, and delisting it. The next tier down, tier 2, maybe doesn't have as strong of water quality control procedures, but it's really the power of the numbers. So while agencies might not be able to have eyes on every stream, these communities do. And so they can set the alarm bells if something is happening and really alert these agencies to, hey, we've gotten some really crazy numbers, can you guys, and they recognize that they should come out and they actually collect samples and follow up with them. And then even below that, but still extremely valuable, tier 1 data are data that can really help just educate the community about the baseline water quality conditions. And that's really powerful in just understanding maybe how land use changes are affecting things. So I just have a couple pictures just for fun in the background. So the project that we're working on right now is the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, and it is coming from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So this is, Chesapeake Bay Program through the EPA. So this is the federal agency that is using and recognizing that there is this huge data set of volunteer monitoring data within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and they don't necessarily have the resources yet to get it into their database so that they can use it to assess the health of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So our project, we're teaming up with the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring in Pennsylvania and Dickinson College, University of Maryland Center for Environmental Sciences, and the Isaac Walton League Virginia Save Our Streams program to collaborate and on bringing all the different types and groups of volunteer monitoring programs within the Chesapeake Bay watershed to help kind of work with quality control, quality assurance procedures and getting them kind of in a tiered structure, sort of like the Virginia DEQ uses, so then we can start to have the Chesapeake Bay program, EPA, use that data. And that's extremely exciting for a lot of these volunteer monitoring groups that have been putting a lot of energy and effort into collecting this data and having it used at such a higher level. So it's just a really wonderful example, such as many states that have been really working and partnering with these volunteer groups. That's a great way to get over kind of that assumption that the data is not of a good quality, because it is. And you can work with these groups to really establish that. So that's just kind of some background of what we've been working on. So, okay. Thank you, Anne. You flipped through some pictures, no? Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was just
Go ahead. We actually are ahead of time,
Yeah,
so
okay.
if you'd like to,
Yeah.
I asked all of the speakers to bring pictures. It's my fault. But please go ahead and just tell us what we're seeing here, and then we'll turn things over to Avi.
Sure. So the first slide that I showed you, these are a couple of volunteers that we have that are using a turbidity tube. So it acts like a Secchi disc. You can't always use a Secchi disc in a smaller water body, so you put it in a tube and it has the little Secchi disc at the bottom. So the great thing about volunteer monitoring is you're engaging communities at all ages, all levels, all backgrounds. So we have a couple of young women here being a part of it. These are some monitors who are learning how to take dissolved oxygen measurements, doing a titration. So it looks really scientific, and they get to feel really cool and scientific, but it's really easy. Anyone can learn this. I've worked with people who are ex-bakers to engineers, and everyone can get a handle of this, and that's really the wonderful power of volunteer monitoring. Here are some folks wearing beautiful waders, you know, so stylish, doing some stream assessments. So these are, you know, examples of having more eyes on the ground. And the person on the left is actually works with Virginia DEQ. So seeing them, engaging with them, and having them come out with volunteers is really exciting and valuable. And then, you know, just traditionally scooping up some water. So there you go.
Those waiters, yep.
Yeah.
All right, thank you again.
Excellent. When we were talking before, I guess this was last week, trying to get a handle on what we all wanted to talk about, and it was interesting to hear what Anne was talking about as I was kind of crafting what I wanted to talk about and how they, in the same world, collided and completely missed each other, which really speaks to how the private sector is, I don't want to say forced to, but basically addresses a lot of the wetland monitoring success and how we define success and what everybody else is collecting in terms of data, and how there's 25 years of data that is available and almost 20 years of data that the private sector has for all these constructed wetlands, and you can't compare any of it because what we're collecting is not at all what they've collected. And I think it's a disservice to the academic world that we can't join those data sets, but at the same time there's a lot of great information to be gained from each one. So, you know, maybe as the regulatory arena continues to evolve, we can try to morph these into more of a collaborative data set so that we can, from here forward, really compare and contrast things going forward. So a lot of what I've put together talks about things from the private perspective, which, you know, you'll see, given what Anne just presented and discussed, is really quite different. And not necessarily in a bad way, but it's just in a different way. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit about the last 15 or so years of what we have to do for constructed wetland monitoring. And that's really what we're going to talk about. Is nobody pays us to go out and monitor wetlands that are already there, because from the private perspective, there's no money in it for anybody to have hired us to do that. And at the end of the day, that's what it unfortunately comes down to. So we're going to talk about how the evolution of what success is defined as has changed in the past 15 years. And a lot of the same challenges that Anne faces and that Tom faces and everybody faces is quality consistency of your data, because it's done by different consultants, sometimes different people within the same consulting company year over year, statewide. You're going to get a lot of different things in different formats, and how do you handle that? So we're going to start in the early 2000s, which I've called the Wonder Years, and kind of wonder what they were thinking in some of these requirements. So we start with invasive species, which are the bane of many of our existence. We had to monitor them, but we didn't really say anything as far as success goes based on presence, absence, or density of invasive species. You just noted that you had them and you moved on. You didn't have to treat them. You didn't have to eradicate them. There was a note in your report, and on we went. There was this density requirement for planting oaks, which, I mean, I understand that oaks are very important as far as the Virginia ecosystem goes, but to mandate that we have 50 stems an acre in year 1 and then 150 at the end of year 3 and through closeout, which closeout for us is typically a 10-year monitoring term, and we'll just use that as a discussion base because it can change. But we had this oak density requirement, and we didn't really have a soil success criteria. And if you know the definition of wetlands, you have to have hydric soils, you have to have a dominance of hydrophytic vegetation, and you've got to have your hydrology. So you have to have all these, but you're just assuming if you have hydrology, then your soils are met and you moved on. So in the mid to late 2000s, we're trending in the right direction. We've started to think about invasive species, but we only needed to treat the ones that really threaten the viability of a constructed wetland. This is actually a picture I took last December of a constructed wetland in the Charlottesville area, and that is all Russian olive. which is not a native plant, and there are 2 trees that are native that are in there. So I would say that the Russian olive definitely meets that definition of threatening the overall efficacy of this constructed wetland. But we didn't have to treat them anywhere else or treat invasive species that were found in emergent wetland systems at all, which is where you have the most difficult to treat with your Phragmites and your cattails, your microstegium, your stilt grasses and stuff like that around here. Our magical oak density requirement is gone, which is good because it didn't make a lot of sense. But we now have to monitor vegetation twice a year in spring and fall. The rationale behind this I don't quite get unless you want to have an early detection of maybe some overwinter mortality of some of your installed plant species. But again, you have the same hydric soils requirement that we had before. But we want to see a trend year over year that the soils are starting to change in their chromas. So today, and I say present day, and that's basically from 2010 till now, there's been very little change in how we have to approach these monitoring sites and programs for constructed wetlands. Invasive species has really, really been ratcheted down, that in all of our sample plots we can't have more than 5% aerial coverage, which is in some instances very, very difficult to achieve, especially when you're creating a new wetland, when these invasives like to be the pioneers and will phase themselves out over time as more of your shade trees become dominant. But there's constant treatment and constant adaptive management, which is, I think, a really important thing that our industry has taken hold of, is understanding that there's no magic bullet for treating one of these systems. You have to look at each one separately and craft an adaptive management plan to deal with the site-specific circumstances that you may encounter. Still no more oaks, which is fine. We plant them anyway, but we're not required to hit certain percentages. There are some metrics for tree height and percentage change in some trees. Now, I should say that this is not done for all of these constructed wetlands, but for some of them, which again makes comparing data sets year over year and between different sites very difficult, because you may have this parameter in some and you don't have it in others. But the rationale behind this, as far as we can discern, is at the end of the day, at 10 years down the road, you want to start to have some mature vegetation, mature woody vegetation in these created wetlands, and you want to make sure that you don't have a bunch of large and small tubulings all over the place just to meet our stem density requirements, which is one of the factors we have to achieve, is 400 stems per acre. And again, our soil profiles are required. We want to see soils trending towards a hydric direction if they're not already. We like to be able to reuse hydric soils when we can. If we're stripping off some topsoil and make a wetland larger, we want to be able to spread that out because the seed base is there too. But the challenges that we faced, and again I hit on some of them, is how we define success. And we have to achieve a minimum of 400 woody stems per acre. And this is extrapolated based on our sample plots, which are randomly distributed through our created wetlands. And if we don't have that, our wetland is defined as not being successful. And what we would love to find out is, well, is that reflective of a quote-unquote natural wetland system in that area? We're not required to use a reference wetland before we design and construct one of these mitigation wetlands to compare the existing condition of a quote-unquote stable natural wetland system in the immediate vicinity or on-site with what we're designing. The design is done more or less the same across the board, as we need to have 400 stems an acre, so everybody overplants, sometimes as many as 600, understanding that they're going to have 85% of them survive, and you still meet your 400 stems, and so nobody has to come back out and revegetate them. I would love for that to be different. I would, in talking with some folks, both my colleagues at my company, some folks at other companies, Angler Environmental being one of them, and the Department of Environmental Quality, is we would love to be able to compare some of these restoration wetlands with these natural wetland systems, doing these stem counts and aerial coverage counts and herbaceous cover counts to see how they compare. And in my view, having traveled around through many a swamp, including yesterday, is they're very, very different in composition. So we define hydrology and constructed wetlands very differently than the Army Corps of Engineers has defined it, and it's fortuitous that Jan is sitting here and is going to back cleanup for us, and she can hit on this as well, or maybe just hit me. But our from a constructed wetland definition is more strict. It is the old standard, so we have to meet wetland hydrology, which is 12.5% of the growing season in a given year. And if we don't meet that, and we use automated loggers and piezometers and stuff like that, if we don't meet that, we don't meet our wetland hydrology component. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers and the regional supplements have come out and said, really 12.5% is a little high. Somewhere between 5 and 12.5% is really your sweet spot. So if we were to do a wetland delineation on this area, it may meet it. But for our success for our created wetland, it may not. So that's a little bit of how things have changed from the regulatory arena. And we also still see some inconsistencies from the regulatory side. Is some are willing to look the other way with certain invasive species that everybody knows are going to come and colonize, but eventually they will take themselves out of the equation. And some want everything eradicated every year, no questions asked. And that's fine, but consistency, at least from the private sector, is the name of the game, is what we're trying to find, and all play by the same rules, and not have them change on us based on where we are geographically in the state. And the final challenge is trees. We are almost forced to create forested wetlands. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Forested wetlands are great. But we're skipping wetland evolution from the emergent to the scrub shrub, and then ultimately to your forested wetland system, which a lot of people are going to say, well, is your most environmentally beneficial wetland system, and that's absolutely true. But we have to do that from day one. We have to start achieving aerial cover of mature, late successional vegetation from year one out. We have cover requirements, we have height requirements on these things, and it's sometimes very difficult to get certain species of oak, for example, to really grab hold and take, given soil chemistry, which quite honestly very few people take into account based on your geology and your acidity and pHs of your soils, what species are going to thrive and which ones just aren't. And we've had entire areas where red maple, for some reason, just doesn't work. And if you've been out in the woods, red maple grows everywhere. But on the side of this hill in northern Loudoun County, Virginia, it won't grow. It just won't do it. So we had to change things. But it is a challenge to establish these late successional plants from day one, while still maintaining everything else. Then real quickly, just data quality. Who's collecting it? What are they not collecting? And what I'm sure you've seen missing from all of this that I've talked about so far is water quality data. We don't do it. We don't have to do it. It's not used for anything in any of our success criteria. It doesn't check a box for any of our stuff. So we don't collect it. And if we were to collect it in the name of science, that's great. But it does take a lot of time to collect in these larger wetland systems that you're constructing. And I know that none of my clients are going to pay us to do that. But I think it is hugely valuable to understand what your temperature of your water in these wetland systems is, because if it's too hot, you don't have enough shade, and you're not going to get your biota, and your flora and fauna are going to suffer. So we have that issue. Time of year that you're collecting data. It's very difficult when you're in the middle of October or beginning of November if you don't understand what a 12-inch tall red maple looks like with no leaves on it and just stems and twigs to deal with to identify it correctly. So that is always a challenge. And then the qualifications to collect it. Oftentimes it's your entry-level or junior-level field staff that are tasked with going out and collecting all this data on vegetation plots, because it is not super exciting to do, but it's very, very important, and a lot of times they don't have 10, 15, 20 years worth of field experience to have seen a lot of the different shapes that these small plants can take, because they don't look the same as the mature vegetation. We've taken over projects from other consultants where the data we've provided or that they've collected is completely insufficient to meet all the requirements, and we have to start over. and that's not a good place to be in when you can't rely on data that's been collected already. You also have differences between the same company. You have different field crews going out, sometimes in a different week, sometimes on two crews on one site, and people are going to focus on different things, just human nature. We have a big issue with what to do with volunteer species. When do we count them? How tall should they be in order to count? And how many do you count when you have a whole bunch of them right next to each other? Green ash is a great example. Black locust, another one, is they just take over an area. And if you have 52 2-inch tall black locusts, do you count 52 of them? Do you count them as 5, 10? There's no guidance for us to do it. So some people do it one way, some people do it another way, and everything in between. So there is that inconsistency, and you can imagine what that does to your stem densities when you have a 400 square foot plot and 50 of one species. You're definitely going to meet your stem densities. And then with all technology, we do have issues with using automated loggers. We had 2 of them fail on us last year. One was a battery issue, and the other one just went corrupt. So we lost 2 wells, which is why we put many of them in, but we don't have data. You lose data, and it's unfortunate, but it does happen. So that, I'm done. And hopefully I didn't run too long and put everyone to sleep. We'll let you in.
Now you really have me wondering how that red maple we put in last Thursday in my backyard, how it's going to like it there. I hope it does. But thank you again, and the the contrast that you created with your presentation was very noticeable from a moderator perspective, and hopefully for our audience, and it will generate some good discussion here in a few moments. But right now, Jan, I want to say ELI is just so pleased to have you with us here today and have your perspective. Jan is the Director of Wetlands and Water for the National Wildlife Federation. So we did ask her to clean up here and provide, an overall, a national, perhaps, perspective to the state and regional and local projects involving citizen science that you've heard from our presenters already. So Jan, I'll turn it over to you.
And I told you all not to give me more than 5 minutes because I didn't think I'd have much to say. So
6.
Right. So I'm not sure I can carry all of that water. But so I'll start by saying first, let the record show that well-paid, highly educated private consultants also have inconsistent wetland results. Speaking as one who's been trying to defend the Clean Water Rule and the Corps of Engineers for many years, I just want to say this is hard work, and it's hard to get right. and rather than into a lot of details around that work, which is very detailed, I guess I just thought I would say I think a lot of what you said, Avi, in terms of the challenges really, to me, in a way, reinforce the need for real eyes on the ground and citizen activism and monitoring, because I kept hearing you say not only are there all these challenges in terms of getting the numbers right, but, because of the private sector role, you kept saying, these are the things we're required to do. It's all about doing the things you're required to do. But what about when those 10 years are up? And what about that data that you're not required to collect? And what about the invasive species that you're not required to get rid of? To me, that is what underlies, as a wetlands advocate, a lot of my interest in seeing and wishing for a lot more eyes on the ground when it comes to mitigation wetlands as well as natural wetlands. So with that, I just thought I'd walk through a few things that I think resonate. I was going to speak from my perspective, but I think reflect a number of the themes that were raised. And so National Wildlife Federation is, we've got something like 6 million members. We really started in 1936 as a conservation education organization, Ranger Rick, and I mean, that's what we're all about. And more recently, really connecting people to nature, and I know that was mentioned as a highlight of what a lot of this monitoring work is about, and particularly children, recognizing that children are losing their connection with the outdoors, and unless we can reconnect children with wetlands, we will never be able to make the case for wetlands protection long term. So those are critical goals. And then, of course, for me and my wetlands and water work, conserving wetlands and water resources through strong federal and state clean water and habitat protections is a lot of what I do. But as an organization, it's a lot about connecting people with nature. So we also have, we don't run monitoring programs as a national organization. We do a lot of conservation education, but the National Wildlife Federation has affiliates in almost every state. And I did a little bit of polling, and several of our affiliates are very active in water quality monitoring or watershed monitoring. And I think actually the Delaware Nature Society, I think I noticed quickly, is actually mentioned in Jim's publication as an example. And I think it is a really good example of, another good example of these wetland water quality monitoring programs that also really build out these other pieces that are so important. Another one is our Kentucky Waterways Alliance is our Kentucky affiliate, and they have a watershed watch program that they've been running for 18 years. And in both of these cases, if you look on the websites, you can see that there's a, you care about these waters, here are several ways that you can get involved in there, everything from hawk watches and bird watching to very technical monitoring programs. But I think these serve really important functions, and as I said, fundamentally just, and I think Anne mentioned this too, educating, building that environmental literacy around wetlands and waters, and then mobilizing citizens to protect those waters. Once I did this as a personal volunteer in Minnesota, once you're out there on that water, people would tell us, oh, that's a sedimentation pond, that's not worth protecting. And we're like, no, that is our lake that we love, and we are going to get it on the impaired waters list, and we are going to get it protected, and that becomes a galvanizing force for a whole community. And I think especially in a watershed context, we haven't really spoken about the watershed approach and the watershed context, but I guess I'd be interested in what others think. But I guess I'm a real believer that when people understand that they are part of a watershed, just like they're part of a city or a school district, then they understand better and connect better to what's important, and what happens upstream really impacts what happens downstream in their communities. I think when you mobilize those citizens, then you can then organize those voices to actually have some say on water policy and have some say on priorities in the watershed. And then also, as you've already heard reflected, that volunteer base becomes a constituency of the state and EPA at the federal level, but especially if you have a Virginia DEQ or a Wisconsin DNR, people working all these years as professionals, and they want to do the right thing, but you've got to have that constituency of taxpayers and voters that really are there to back that up and insist on accountability and performance by those state professionals, as well as then not only a constituency, political constituency, but a volunteer auxiliary to be able to actually get out there and magnify, have more boots on the ground. Again, a lot of what I'm saying is obvious, but this role of having eyes on the resource and being able to identify the threats, you see now in the Chesapeake now, these, I know EPA, but also some of the other groups are being funded to come up with these, apps and systems where they're out there kayaking and they can take pictures and they can put them together. It's been talked about a few times. But that's so important to be able to have those eyes out there to identify the threats, identify the oil spill that happened in Dykes Marsh not too long ago, and then be able to follow up and publicize those impacts so that people don't just sweep them under the rug. And then, of course, we've talked about just having the data, the real water quality data results and habitat data that can be used in all the ways you've heard. On the wetland monitoring front, I would just like to say that one thing I would really like to see is more real citizen monitoring of these mitigation sites. As I said, just you know, the IRTs are there. Presumably you have the federal and the state agencies serving on these teams. I'm forgetting what interagency review teams. But I know from my litigation work down in South Florida and from growing up down in South Florida, you know, the wetland gets made and created as a counterpoint to the 600-acre luxury golf course development, and then within 2 years it's like, well, maybe we'd like to get back in there and move this road around, and nobody, unless somebody's really paying attention, or subject even subject to a legal settlement, unless people are there paying attention to hold people accountable for those decisions, you know, the wetland just magically disappears. So I'd like to see them all much more easily accessible data about where these sites are. These are public resources now that are replacing destroyed wetlands, and in my view, we need people to really be paying attention, know where those are, and be going back and checking and making sure that they're there, much less whether they're invasives on them or not. So with that, I'd just say I do think, you know, we talked a lot about quality and consistency challenges that you all are doing a great job working on, but I really do believe that this issue of transparency and easy access to data is so critical. As you talked about simplicity even in terms of monitoring things, but, you know, I don't know how to use rivets, and I'm a professional, you know. I mean, and FOIA, you know, nobody gets their FOIA requests completed in a timely manner. So people need to be able to go on a map just like they go on a road map and be able to find these places, just as one example. And then more real encouragement of public involvement, but I think more in a way of really embracing volunteers for what they bring to the conservation effort, you know, as opposed to pushing them away, considering them a nuisance, not responding to their FOIA requests, not wanting them around. We need to really embrace this volunteer force as helping us all protect these resources. With that.
Thank you very much. Right, well, we've had some excellent and thought-provoking presentations, and our audience has been patient, and so I would like to turn it over to you and to engage our panelists in discussions, ask questions. Do we have anybody that would like to begin? Go ahead. And please, if you would, just identify yourself. That would be great before you ask your question.
Ramesh Reddy from University of Florida. Ramesh Reddy from University of Florida, Soil and Water Sciences Department. I want to thank the panel there for the excellent presentations. Really enjoyed. Also, citizen-based monitoring programs sounds very interesting. I think very effective in a way to get the citizens involved. But one thing I'm looking for, I think, is your monitoring programs of water. You're monitoring that one, and monitoring vegetation. But one important component of wetland system is missing: soils. Whenever we get to soil sampling, and everybody thinks it's too complicated, you can't do that one. So I think that there's an opportunity exists here, involving citizens in a way, just like we do with agricultural soil sampling. You know, homeowners actually send their samples to local soil testing labs. All land-grant universities have those facilities. They would do it for free, or maybe for peanuts, $1 or $2. You can get those samples analyzed and then have some minimum data sets. You don't need a complicated analysis. Actually, I was involved with ESEPA, wrote a document on soil indicators which we could use for minimum data sets, which we actually promoted the idea of using local soil testing labs to get the samples analyzed. And we are practicing that to some extent in Florida, and also we have a Lake Watch program where actually citizens participate in water quality monitoring. So for soils, there's an opportunity exists. So I just want to say that to you and see if you have any other thought process that you want to include, or if I can help you anyway to provide that information, I'm happy to do that.
Any other comments from our panel on soil testing and monitoring specifically?
You raised a great point. I know that when we look at the feasibility of constructing a wetland, we do exactly that. We dig soil profiles, we send them down to Virginia Tech to run myriad analyses on the soil properties. It's like $50 for way more data than we could ever need or want. You can certainly get that down to $15 to $20 for your more basic stuff. But you literally ship them a box of dirt, or you find a football game to go to and drive it, and they do it for you, and they do it pretty quickly and inexpensively, and it's a great resource here locally that we have. And yes, if you want to find out why you can't go grass in your lawn, you can send them a free sample also. But it is something that's missing from the monitoring requirements from our end, from the private sector, is we look at it in terms of meeting the Army Corps of Engineers definition of a wetland, which is a published definition. That's our goal. That's the goal at the end of the rainbow for us. But we don't need to know any other soil properties, which I don't know is a good thing. I think there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be studied from having those data.
Yeah, please.
So, couple of things that made me, what you said made me think. When we plan a mitigation or reviewing a mitigation plan or looking to restore a site, the soils investigation is one of the most important things that we do, because you get the history of the land from the soil. You can see where the original hydric soil is buried by alluvium in southeastern Wisconsin, where that stuff has run down from the uplands into the wetland. And you can plan your restoration to remove that overburden. Sometimes there's a drainage ditch right next to that. That becomes the basis of your plug. And not only are you able to erase the drainage ditch, but you're able to give sunlight to the hydric soil that still has that seed bank that's going to have a fantastic response. So the people that have done the planning on the soils end up front really use that information to figure out how to do their project. I've got a question for you. In 10 years after restoration, I don't have a real good handle on what you'd expect to see in terms of trends in the soils.
It depends on the type of ecosystem working on. One thing you would see in 10 years, at least I can talk to you about a constructed wetland in Orlando, near city of Orlando. This is about 4,000 acres, maybe 4,000 acres. The pasture land converted into wetlands some 20 years ago. You go back and sample those surface soils, now you got a really good organic matter accumulation. So that's a good indicator of showing the last 10 years in how much organic matter you accumulated, so how much carbon you actually sequestered. Mm-hmm. So that's one indicator. Those kind of simple measurements can provide you a lot of information here.
Thanks.
Okay. You have another question?
Hi, my name's Lucila. I actually work right around the corner for a company called Agriculture Partners. But I come from a background of environmental education, so I'm very fascinated by a lot of the discussions that you guys proposed today, so thank you for sharing. My question is more directly related to Anne and to Jan, but I welcome the other panelists to answer as well. There's mention of engagement of communities. I just wanted to understand a little bit more on what is the profile of your volunteers that are involved in the citizen science monitoring programs that you're offering. Are you seeing a heavier emphasis of people within a certain income class, education level, certain background, language spoken? I'm very intrigued to learn what you're noticing and then efforts that you're making to increase representation of other groups that may not currently be heavily involved.
Okay, so the question is a profile of the volunteer, or the trained volunteers, I'm learning to say, as a matter of fact. Go ahead.
Yeah, so a lot of what volunteer monitoring groups see are people who have time to spend and volunteer. So oftentimes you do see a large group of retired people in that age range, and the communities that are educated about environmental issues enough to ask those questions. So it's diverse in that sense. Something that I know a lot of groups are working on are thinking about working with schools and getting in at an earlier level and engaging students of lots of different backgrounds and environments and working through school programs so that they don't have to use their time outside of school in order to engage. So with working with them, they kind of open up their ideas and their minds to environmental sciences, which is not strongly pushed in schools instead of like the hard sciences, and actually seeing, you know, kind of how it is to actually go out in the field and collect a water sample, and that's a career that they could follow. So there's a lot of programs that are starting to build up around that in order to kind of increase kind of the audience and the age range and then the diversity of the groups that are working with. So those are some kind of fun projects that we're working on currently to kind of help diversify a little bit.
Maybe just that answers the question, but maybe just to broaden it a little bit, just as an example, one of our District of Columbia affiliate is Earth Conservation Corps, which actually has is using the boathouse down on the Anacostia River. And they're an example of that I haven't really seen other places where they're actually using that location in the Anacostia River and that typically pretty poor community as a way, as a kind of a work training program. So they're actually both bringing these young adults to the water and to the resource. They actually have a falconry program of all things. So it's very innovative, but also wetland restoration and cleanups and such. But they're bringing these students to and really putting them to work on like a stipend work, work study program. But really the goal of which is to both connect them to nature and to the water, but also really give them real skills in landscaping, in organizing, and leading monitoring programs. So it's just something to think about in terms of what the potential is.
On that, Jan, just to kind of make a connection, make it a little clearer with that program, really the focus is on youth at risk. So this training and this engagement, they are finding results in kids staying in school, kids staying out of trouble. I mean, they're actually measuring the results, the social results of this engagement with the populations that they're working with. So I think that's a really, really, as you said, innovative and very socially important aspect of that work.
Thank you so much for supplementing on that. As a follow-up question to what you just mentioned, earlier in your discussion you talked about building a constituency for voters who can then demonstrate the importance of filling in gaps in monitoring or in environmental stewardship for different habitats that exist around the area where voters are living, right? I'm wondering if there is any thought to programs that are similar to Earth Environment Corps to build constituency of people that you are investing in trying to lift up environmental literacy, and then to translate that into funding that then continues that sort of work that engages youth at risk or communities that are not currently represented in citizen science projects. It's like AmeriCorps, Student Conservation Association. I personally work in the space, and I find that there is a severe lack of funding for specifically engaging communities of color with conservation action. And this is kind of the thing that's really needed is voters that are concerned about this particular group of people being involved in conservation because they are also a powerful force in voting. So just wondering if that might be in discussion or thought that is circulating through the conservation organizations.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and you all, it sounds like you all may be part of those discussions as much or more. I think it is starting to be talked about. I mean, it's been interesting. What it makes me think of as you ask the question is some of the discussions around the Flint crisis, for example, which isn't nature so much. But interestingly, when the Flint crisis happened, there were a number of us that got on the phones with not only environmental organizers or organizers coming out of those poor communities, but also with the labor unions, the pipe fitters, and so when Flint happened, it was very interesting to me to get on the phone and listen to these people talk. This is like Joe the plumber, and part of the Blue-Green Alliance, and these guys in Michigan just took a Saturday or 2 or 3 or 4 and literally went into the community and donated time in public housing facilities to put on filters and advise people. And it was very interesting to me when you talk, that's made me think of this as the voter connection, is that I think for a lot of us, sadly, we just have no experience. We just don't have a window into just what life is like. And when these guys talked about walking into these homes with, women with breastfeeding babies and literally no access to water, to clean water, it was just heartbreaking, and it was really an eye-opening for a lot of these people that hopefully they take that experience back. And one of the messages coming out of the organizers is, don't just come in here and give us filters. Don't just come in here and give us bottled waters. Teach us how to understand these problems and deal with them ourselves.
I'm going to jump in real quick with a question from online. So this question is for Avi. Could you comment on the potential for the difference between definitions? For example, hydrology, adaptive management, so different definitions undermining data quality and data integrity with different sources.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
I think you might have to answer it in pieces. It's certainly a challenge because, and again, the points that I raised are relegated to Virginia because that is where we do the bulk of our work. And the Department of Environmental Quality and the Norfolk District Army Corps of Engineers have established what success is to us and what they are going to hold us to as a standard. If you go to Arkansas or Oklahoma or Alaska, you may have different parameters entirely. You may have some of them be the same, and you may have different benchmarks within the same parameter. And it's just one of the inherent issues and problems with the whole industry and mitigated wetlands is, they're trying to get everyone to play by the same playbook and follow the same rules, and it is an admirable direction ahead, and is really difficult to enforce and hold everybody to, because you have these programs that were established in 2003, and you have those that are established yesterday, and they play by different rules because their contractual obligation, which is the banking instrument, is inherently and fundamentally different. It goes back to the slides I presented. It's in some respects a lot harder now, and in some respects it's easier now. But the challenges that are faced in data quality and collecting the data, I don't know that, again, that there's an easy way to address it or to fix it other than having a requirement on who runs a field crew or who is responsible for QA/QC of the collected field data to make sure that it's collected in a manner that's appropriate to meet the needs of the program, or even a training mechanism or training program. But without that being run or mandated by the state government or federal government, there's nothing we can do for it. And I know that they don't have the time or resources to throw at that, which is another hurdle. So I don't mean to throw up a bunch of roadblocks and say that it can't be done. It can certainly be done. It's a function of time and money, just like everything else, and money being primarily state and federal funding, to get everybody on an equal footing. And Tom, I know you've got a bunch of experience in Wisconsin with mitigated wetlands and varying success and all of that. Is something successful that only has 250 stems an acre? I would argue in a lot of cases, yeah, it is. But it doesn't meet our requirements. So therefore it is not, and we have to make it so. I don't know if that answers some part or all of what they asked, but I hope I remembered enough of it to hit it.
Just as a quick follow-up, if you could speak also a little bit to the challenges then of data integration, if you do have these different sources and how to overcome those. Perhaps.
And I'm glad that question got asked because it's something that I had in my notes that I forgot to turn the page to look at. Because here, I'm still on my first slide. But I made it all the way through, I promise. So all of the data that's collected for dozens of wetland and stream banks through Virginia is submitted annually to the state and the Army Corps for review to make sure we either hit or miss our success criteria. And there the data sits. It is on a server somewhere in a data center, probably in Ashburn, and it doesn't go anywhere. Nobody does anything with it. And I think, again, from the academic world, that's a huge disservice to the whole community, is we have 15 years of data, and some of it is similar and some of it not, but it's good data. No data is bad data. And nobody has the time or resources to do anything with it. I know in talking with DEQ Monday, that they would love for somebody to come in and just digest everything they have. They don't have time to babysit them, but if somebody wants to do that for a master's or a PhD, then have at it. You dissect it all, figure out what the shortcomings are of what we have to collect, figure out what we're doing right from a protocol standpoint and how this whole system can be improved, because I think nationally we can all benefit from that. Because if we're collecting things that we need not be collecting, then let's fix that. Or if we're not collecting things, i.e. water quality, then, well, let's fix that too. But a lot of our wetlands are not inundated systems. We don't have inches or feet of water that we're dealing with because it's really hard to get a pin oak to grow in 4 inches of water because they don't like to do that. You got to build little mounds to get them up out of it, and then they can take hold. But most of our systems don't have enough water in it when we're out there sampling to get a viable, good sample that's not going to be unusable in some cases. So I think just somebody doing something with the data would be great for everybody, community-wide.
Great. So we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lauren Kovach. I'm an intern with the World Wildlife Fund, and we're actually working on a crowdsourcing platform to crowdsource data on human adaptations to climate change, so this is all very fascinating to me. So thank you. My question is the data accessible to the public? I wasn't quite clear if it is online or if the public can access this data that they're collecting themselves. And then if so, has there been any research that you know of, either by your team or other scholars in the field, that discusses the potential negative impacts or critiques of crowdsourcing data, using citizen science or these different methods that we're seeing nowadays? So thanks.
Sure, I can.
I guess, that's the question. Do you make the data that you collect available to the people who have collected it for you?
Yeah, it totally varies by the individual group. A lot of the work that we're doing right now is taking a census of all the monitoring groups in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and just seeing how diverse their approaches to sharing their data. Some of them just keep it on their data sheets in a file cabinet. Some of them put it on a database that's available online to the public. Some of them submit it to the states, and then the states do have portals to make that available, and then there's also some national portals. But sometimes those are pretty arduous for a volunteer monitor to get through. So one of the projects that we're working on in the Chesapeake Bay region is to develop a database that a lot of the water quality monitoring data from these groups can go into so it can be accessible to the public. And so the volunteers can engage with their own data and see what monitoring groups in the watershed next to them are also collecting, so they can start to compare and contrast. But there's a lot of need for that, I think.
As far as our stuff goes, Jan alluded to it a little bit. There's a website that the Corps of Engineers runs and maintains, Ribbits with one B, RIBITS. If you Google it, it'll be your first result. It's not as scary of a website to get through as initially thought when I first loaded it, when it was first released. In theory, you can select whatever district nationwide that you want information from. So Virginia would select Norfolk, and it pops up with a menu. It highlights the state of Virginia. You can click on things as existing banks, and in theory, for every bank that is approved, you can go into their cyber repository and you can view their banking agreement. You can view their prospectus, which says how they're going to approach the overall project. You can view all of their monitoring reports. You can view long-term management plans, corrective action plans, adaptive management. All of these pieces of information, in theory, and I can't stress that enough, are on Ribbits. Some bank sponsors are better than others at getting all the information up there. There is a box you can check when you upload stuff that keeps it private. So if people check that box, then it never becomes public. But you should be able to find a lot of data through Ribbits nationwide.
So just on my end, that same project that I was telling you about, we're just now putting the data onto what we call SWIMS, Surface Water Information Management System, so that that will become available. But it's a good point. You have to factor that in. It's really easy to go collect data and then forget about giving it back to the people who gave it to you. And it's obviously critical to keeping people involved.
Great. With that, I'll turn
Yes,
things
I'd
over
like to again congratulate our 2016 awardees, and from ELI headquarters, thank you again to our presenters for a great session.